Hey, everybody. So, on behalf of Chapel Hill Public Library and our partners on this event, which include Carolina Public Humanities and the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition, I just wanted to welcome you to A Warning Then, A Warning Now, and to remind you of all the things. Turn your phones off. You think you have, but you have not. The restrooms are in our lobby. If you need them, there will be an announcement saying the library is closing. And if we are still here at 8:50, we will hear that announcement. We can ignore it, but it will interrupt. But I just want, so that's that bit. The other thing I wanted to share and to encourage you all to do two things. One, always support your friends of the library because they make programs possible here at the library, along with our other partners, of course. And one of the programs that the Friends of the Library are making possible this year is our Community History Book Club. And we are doing this in partnership with Bridging the Gap with Anita Mason Hogans. And this year we are reading Black Folk by Blair L.M. Kelly, who is now with the North Carolina Humanities, or not, sorry, National Humanities Center. She will be joining us on one of the sessions, along with Dr. Freddie Parker will be joining us. He's in the back here. He'll be our featured speaker on one of the sessions as well, along with many others. It's going to be a fabulous series. We've got flyers. Y'all are welcome to grab if you're interested. We have a limited number of copies of the book that are available for free as well. And that is, again, thanks to the Friends of the Library. If you can, though, we always encourage folks to support your local independent bookstore. Flyleaf Books is selling these in partnership with us. They'll give you a discount if you go and order a copy through them. And even better, if you can, buy 2 copies. They'll keep one to donate to a fellow community member. So that's a wonderful partnership that we've had for the 3rd year running with this book club series. So I highly recommend. And anybody who's come to these book clubs knows that they are a lot of fun. We're doing hard history in these series, but we are doing it with joy. So we have food. We feed you with a meal. We have art. We have music. We're going to have Christian Fushi Greene as our first artist. So next Thursday, if you've ever seen him perform, you know you don't want to miss it. So come on out for that. We'll have, it'll just be great. So without further ado, James, you're up.
Thank you, Molly. My name is James Williams. I am a founder, former co-chair of OCCRC, Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition, currently serve as program chair of the coalition, and the Chapel Hill Public Library and Molly and her team are crucial, critical partners of the work that we do, and we appreciate them so much. So in addition to the Chapel Hill Public Library and the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition, Carolina Public Humanities is also a co-sponsor of this event, and some of them are present also, and so we appreciate you also. And I want to say a welcome to everybody in attendance. You know that this event was previously scheduled for some date in January. The weather didn't permit us to do it then, but we're here now. I'm glad that you're here. I do want to, I know we have a few or some elected public officials in the House. I'm not going to call out all your names, but if you will stand, we'll recognize you and appreciate you being here with us today. I know that there are probably 2 that are standing, 1 or 2 that are standing because they're just coming in. I do want to acknowledge the George H. White Bar from Durham. There are members of the bar who, there are three there, and I think Dawn is already here. So we really appreciate your being with us here this evening. And I also want to acknowledge Jim Wren and his wife Mavis, who came all the way here from Tarboro, North Carolina, to be with us this afternoon. They are key members of the Phoenix Society there in that county and Edgecombe, and that organization has done so much to lift up and tell the history of that area for years now. But also they established the George H. White Day there in Tarboro. So it does my heart good to see them here with us this evening. I'm so pleased that we were able to keep our presenters. Quite often when you have an event scheduled and you have to reschedule it, you lose folk. And these are all busy people, and coming from different places, but they're here, and I'm so pleased. I do want to do sort of a brief introduction because you have your programs there, and their introductions, I mean, their bios, or at least their shortened bios, are there in the programs. I might want to just add a couple of things. So as you look in your program, there's an order of the various speakers. And that's basically the order in which they will be coming up to speak to you this evening. So I'm not going to stand back up and introduce each speaker when they come up. The only thing that's different is that we are going to begin with Dr. Tim Tyson, and then the second presenter will be Dr. Sonny Kelly. But then once you do that switch, everything else is in order. So Dr. Tim Tyson, most of you know him. He's a historian. He's a writer. He is a senior research scholar at the Center for Documentary Studies. Some of his books include The Blood of Emmett Till, Blood Done Sign My Name, Radio Free Dixie about Robert Williams, and there are others. We're really pleased to have him with us tonight, and he's going to be our opening speaker, and will kind of set the stage historically for the speech that will follow. Dr. Sonny Kelly will do a rendition of the speech. He's a professional performer, storyteller. He's a number of things, but he's also a PhD. He's a scholar. He has a PhD in communications and performance studies from UNC here in Chapel Hill. He's done several plays. One, I think the first one I became aware of was The Talk, but since then he's done The Ongoing Struggle for Freedom. And if you like what you hear here tonight, he's going to be at the Friday Center on Sunday afternoon doing a play called Indivisible. So keep that in mind. Sally Greene, Orange County Commissioner Sally Greene. She certainly is an elected public official. She served the Chapel Hill Town Council, but and she's also a member of the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition, has been for some time. But what most people don't know, and I don't know that she advertises it, she's one of these dual degree people. She has a law degree, and she has a PhD in English from here at UNC at Chapel Hill also, I believe. And so we'll be hearing from her after Sonny Kelly, and putting into context some of the media responses to what George H. White had to say and what he was trying to do. Next, you'll hear from James or Jim LeLoudis, who's a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and the director of the James M. Johnson Center for Undergraduate Excellence. He's also has written, several books, and in fact, one that is so related to what we're talking about this evening is "Fragile Democracy: The Struggle of Race and Voting Rights in North Carolina." Um, and then we'll hear from, and he'll begin to sort of connect, what was happening, what happened then, and what has happened since, and what's happening now, as we speak, so to speak. And then we'll hear from Hilary Harris Klein, who is the senior counsel for voting rights at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. And she will look at some of the legal developments, particularly in voting rights and voter suppression, and some of the very things that we're dealing with today, challenges we're facing today. And then, we'll close with none other than the eminent G.K. Butterfield. Now, Mr. Butterfield has worn a number of hats in his career, so there's a lot that one could say. He served in Congress for, I don't know, what, 15, 18 years. But even before that, I mean, he was a practicing attorney. He's a former Superior Court judge here in the state of North Carolina, and even served a stint on the North Carolina Supreme Court. And while it's not in his resume and he doesn't have the degree behind his name, he's also an historian. And so I'm looking forward to hearing all of our presenters. And I know I've been going on a bit longer than I anticipated or I had planned to, but something came to mind as I was thinking about this. And there is a decision. This is Black History Month. When we had planned to do this, it would have been in January, but this is Black History Month, and I think we can acknowledge that and should acknowledge that, and a lot of what we're dealing with as it relates to both this program, but Black history is truth, and the fact that so often truth about the history of Black people has either been suppressed or submerged or outright lies told. And so, this is an opportunity and another occasion where we're going to be talking truth. And I'm reminded just this week, 3 days ago, in a decision called Philadelphia versus Burgum, federal district court in the state of Pennsylvania. The first paragraph, I'll read it. It says, as if the ministry of truth in George Orwell's 1984 now exists with its motto, ignorance is strength. This court is now asked to determine whether the federal government has the power it claims to dissemble and disassemble historical truths when it has some domain over historical facts. And then it says, it does not. This opinion involves the taking down of historical panels related to slavery at the George Washington House in the city of Philadelphia. And as a part of this ongoing effort by this administration to untell our history, but we're going to keep telling it as we are going to be doing this evening. So, Dr. Tim Tyson.
Amen.
Amen.
I learned to teach if I did, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where we don't need a microphone. I know how to, but the,
Yeah.
Could use it.
I'll use it. Don't you? Glad not to have to holler, though I can. The career of George H. White charts the origins of the segregated world in which some of us grew up and the apartheid America some now seek to rebuild. The future of our past depends on what we choose to do with our present. And that depends on how well we understand our history. George White was born in 1852 on his mixed race family's turpentine farm in the piney woods of Bladen County. From rural poverty, he rose to graduate from Howard University in 1877 at 25. He became a teacher and a principal in New Bern. He passed the North Carolina bar in 1879 at a time when New Bern's burgeoning black population allowed the election of black aldermen and the establishment of many black-owned businesses. You may know from David Soselsky's work what a radical hotbed of liberationist black politics New Bern was during and after the Civil War. And one suspects that some of those folks were still around, or at least their spirit moving there in New Bern. Within a year of entering politics, he won a seat in the state legislature as a Republican. The Republican Party in North Carolina had a white majority, but a significant plurality of black voters. White then became prosecutor in the heart of the 2nd District. 8 of its 10 counties had a black majority. His eloquence and effectiveness became legendary. In the 1880s and 1890s, the conservative Democratic Party, the party of the Confederacy, became dominated by the banks, railroads, and new manufacturing interests. The conservatives served the wealthy at the expense of the less affluent, painted public education as a radical heresy, passed laws that allowed the legislature to appoint local officials, and made it much more difficult for poor folks to vote. These policies inspired many white farmers to leave the Democrats for the People's Party, better known as the Populists, along with some black farmers who, like white farmers, saw populism as a chance for economic advancement, public education, and citizenship rights. Public education, some of the real glue that held the coalition together. In the 1890s, the Populists joined with Republicans, many of them black, to create the Fusion Coalition. George White became a leading fusionist politician, preaching a free vote and a fair count. In 1894, the Fusionists swept the state legislature, funded public schools, and passed more liberal election laws. In 1896, Fusion campaign flyers reminded black voters that 2 years ago, the Republicans and Populists of North Carolina united and made one grand struggle for liberty, which defeated the Democrats and restored black voting rights, which were embattled. The flyers evoked the memory of slavery and Reconstruction violence to prospective black fusionists. The chains of servitude are broken. Now never lick the hand that lashed you. The interracial fusionists won the governorship, every statewide race, and 2 U.S. Senate seats. 87% of eligible black voters cast ballots, virtually all for the Fusion cause. Fusionists elected 11 black men to the state legislature. The North Carolina delegation to the U.S. Congress was 7 white fusionists, 1 sole Democrat, and George H. White. In the 1896 Fusion sweep, White became the only black member of Congress. He opened a second law office in Wilmington, like New Bern, a city with an accomplished black majority, the stronghold of the Fusion Coalition. During the 1896 presidential race, William McKinley chose White to be a stump speaker for his campaign. Victory left White a very influential new congressman. He became a frequent visitor at the White House. Together with White selecting the candidates, McKinley and White appointed about 24 black officials in North Carolina, mostly postmasters, more than any other state. He also helped some white men and white women gain federal appointments. Observers saw White as bound for national prominence and perhaps even the first black cabinet member. White Democrats in North Carolina despised White and despaired of beating fusion politics at the polls. In 1897, certain that the conservatives would try to block black voting by any means necessary, White unsuccessfully urged Congress to enforce Article 2 of the 14th Amendment, which requires that the federal government cut representation in Congress for any states that abridged the right to vote. After their losses in 1894 and 1896, the Democrats denounced so-called Negro domination. They cited as proof virtually any black advancement, with a rising clamor after each black appointment that White secured. The white supremacist demagogues stressed that black postmasters placed white women in the position of having to do business with black men, thus exposing them to the so-called black beast rapist. In the election of 1898, this red-hot rhetoric about black beasts was the centerpiece of the Democrats' campaign. Furnifold Simmons, chair of the Democratic Party, Josephus Daniels, the publisher of the News and Observer, and Charles B. Aycock, a gifted and ambitious orator, plotted what they called the white supremacy campaign. They hired a cartoonist to draw front-page cartoons that featured the incubus of Negro domination. The incubus is a mythological figure that flies into the window of unsuspecting women and has sex with them. One masterpiece depicted a huge vampire bat with Negro rule inscribed on its wings and white women dangling from its claws, with the caption, "The Vampire That Hovers Over North Carolina." They ran fabricated stories of, quote, Negro atrocities, unquote, daily. Black men assaulting or insulting white women, and headlines like Negro control in Wilmington and an incubus that must be removed. 40 years later, Josephus Daniels admitted in his autobiography that his newspaper had been cruel in its flagellations and perfectly willing to play up lies about black men in big type. White met with President McKinley in September of 1898 and warned him of the unholy war that Democrats are making on the color line. The strife and ill feeling stirred up have never existed before and will hurt my people and my state. The violence of the red shirts, a paramilitary arm of the Democratic Party, was just underway. Representative White quoted Democrat W.W. Kitchen, who declared, "Before we allow the Negroes to control this state as they do now, we will kill enough of them that there will not be enough left to bury them." In the fall of 1898, red shirt mobs terrorized the state, breaking up fusionist rallies and mobilizing hundreds of the local white supremacy clubs. Democratic Speaker Alfred Waddell, a former Confederate officer, promised to choke the current of the Cape Fear with black carcasses, if necessary. The violence they plotted was no secret. 2 weeks before the election, the Washington Post ran these headlines: "A city under arms. Blacks to be prevented from voting in Wilmington, NC. Property holding classes determined upon ending Negro domination." The night before the election, Waddell urged a Wilmington audience, "If you find the Negro out voting, tell him to leave the polls. And if he refuses, kill him, shoot him down in his tracks." On election day, a mob of red shirts boarded a train carrying fusionist Governor Daniel Russell. Russell escaped them only by hiding in a pile of luggage in the mailroom. All over the state, armed men from the white supremacy campaign blocked white voters from going to the polls. White managed to win re-election in 1898 only because he ran in a three-candidate race with two white supremacist candidates splitting the conservative vote. People talk about the Wilmington massacre and coup as being the only coup in American history. It wasn't even the only coup in the state. The coup was the state government. That's where the big action is in 1898. When you have armed men at the polls preventing your opponents from voting, I think that qualifies. 3 days after the election, on November 10th, white mobs burned the offices of the Wilmington Daily Record, one of the few black dailies in America. They also destroyed George White's Wilmington Law Office. Led by Waddell and Hugh McCrae, an MIT-trained industrialist, the white mob massacred dozens and perhaps hundreds of black citizens in the streets. McCrae soon wrote that they had killed about 90, in his words. They forced the fusionist city government to resign at gunpoint and declared Waddell the new mayor. The News and Observer's Josephus Daniels heralded the results of the 1898 election season as permanent good government by the party of the white man. In December of 1898, George White called on President McKinley to ask him to see that those responsible for the violence be brought to justice. McKinley said little and did nothing except to tour the South and reassure white voters. The silence of the Republican Party changed White. He declared, "Most of the evils that as a race we in the South complain of grow out of our unflinching support for the Republican Party. It is quite clear that we cannot hope for redress from Republican officials, even though our lives are placed in jeopardy to put them in office." Black Southerners, White came to believe, had three options. They could remain politically active and risk annihilation. They could give up all rights and thus virtually become slaves again, or migrate to northern or western states to avoid racial demagoguery and mob violence. Reluctantly, White came to advocate migration from the terror-ridden sections of the South. This, he explained, would protect those who left the South. For those who remained in the South, it would put black labor at a premium. Black migration to strategic locations, he predicted, would eventually let black voters gain a balance of power sufficient to practically decide who will occupy the presidential chair. This turned out to be true. It just took until 1948. In 1899, the Democrats who had seized power in North Carolina approved what the News and Observer called a permanent solution of the Negro suffrage question. This suffrage amendment, though its language never mentioned black citizens, featured literacy tests, which the legislators made clear would be racially administered. It included a grandfather clause that stipulated that any man whose grandfather had been eligible to vote didn't have to take the literacy test. So ignorant white voters were permitted to vote. In 1900, the Democrats swept North Carolina. Red shirt terror and massive electoral fraud did the rest. Charles B. Aycock was elected governor. Though he came to power in a bloody revolution, as so often happens with people who come to power in a bloody revolution, Aycock moved quickly to consolidate its gains as the legislature passed a raft of segregation laws that constructed a new world. Aycock explained, "We have ruled by force. We can rule by fraud, but we want to rule by law." 4 of the next 5 governors had helped lead the white supremacy campaign, and the 5th applauded it. The Jim Crow social order they built in North Carolina lasted until the modern civil rights era. George White introduced a bill in 1900 that would categorize mob killings as treason as well as murder, which never made its way out of committee. After he made his eloquent 1901 farewell to Congress, which you're about to hear from the brilliant Sonny Kelly, White bid farewell to North Carolina. He moved to Cape May County, New Jersey, where he bought 2,000 acres of land and helped organize a black town where Black Americans, especially refugees from the South, could live in safety and self-sufficiency. A recent census of Cape May County reveals many Black former North Carolina natives with family ties to Wilmington. The people who settled there chose to call it Whitesboro. 40 years later, Josephus Daniels wrote a letter about the white supremacy campaigns of 1898 and 1900. He wrote, "When Governor Aycock was elected and we adopted the grandfather clause, I said to him that I was very glad that we had settled the Negro question for all times." Aycock's response haunted him and speaks to us now, though perhaps not as he intended. Aycock said, "Joe, you are badly mistaken. I hope we have settled the Negro question for 25 years. Every generation will have the problem on their hands, and they will have to settle it for themselves." Thank you.
Congress will now come to order. The chair recognizes the Honorable Congressman from North Carolina, George H. White.
Mr. Chairman, there are others on this committee and in this House who are far better prepared and enlightened in the world with their eloquence as to what the agriculturalists of this country need than your humble servant. I therefore resign to more competent minds the discussion of this bill. I shall consume the remainder of my time reverting to measures and facts that are in them more weighty in interest to me and mine than that of agriculture, matters of life and existence. I want to enter a plea for the colored man, the colored woman, the colored boy, and the colored girl of this country. I would not thus digress from the question at issue and detain the House in a discussion of the interests of this particular people at this time, but for the constant and persistent efforts of certain gentlemen upon this floor that would mold and rivet public sentiment against us as a people and lose no opportunity to hold up the unfortunate few who commit crimes and depredations and lead lives of infamy and shame, as other races do, as fair specimens of representatives of the entire colored race. In the catalog of members of Congress in this House, perhaps none have more persistent in their determination to bring the black man into disrepute, and with a labored effort to show that he was unworthy of the right of citizenship than my colleague from North Carolina, Mr. Kitchen. During the first session of this Congress, while the constitutional amendment was pending in North Carolina, he labored long and hard to show that the white race was at all times and in all circumstances superior to the Negro, by inheritance, if not otherwise. And the excuse for his party supporting that amendment, which has since been adopted, was that an illiterate Negro was unfit to participate in making the laws of a sovereign state. But an illiterate white man living by his side with no more or perhaps not as much property, with no more exalted character, no higher thoughts of civilization, no more knowledge of the handicraft of government, had by birth, because of his whiteness, inherited some peculiar qualification. In the town where this young gentleman was born, at the general election last August for the adoption of the constitutional amendments and the general election for state and county offices, Scotland Neck had a registered white vote of 395, most of whom, of course, were Democrat, and a registered colored vote of 535, virtually, if not all of whom, were Republicans. And registered colored votes of 535. When the count was announced, however, there were 831 Democrats to 75 Republicans. But in the town of Halifax, same county, the result was much more pronounced. In the town, the registered Republican vote was 345. And the total registered vote of the township was 539. But when the count was announced, it stood at 990 Democrats, 41 Republicans, or 492 more Democratic votes counted than were registered votes in the township. Comment here is unnecessary, nor do I think it necessary for anyone to wonder at the peculiar notion my colleague has with references to the manner of voting and the method of counting these votes, nor is it to be a wonder that he is a member of this Congress, having been brought up and educated in such wonderful notions of dealing out fair-handed justice to his fellow man. It would be unfair of me, however, for me to leave the inheritance, the inference upon the minds of those who hear me that all white people of the state of North Carolina hold views with Mr. Kitchen and think as he does. Thank God there are many with noble expectations to the example he sets. That too in the Democratic Party. Men who have never been afraid that one uneducated, poor, depressed Negro could put to flight and chase into degradation two educated, wealthy, thrifty white men. There never has been, nor ever will be, any Negro domination in that state. And no one knows it better than the Democratic Party. It is a convenient howl, however, often resorted to in order to consummate a diabolical purpose by scaring the weak and gullible white goat voters into support of measures and men suitable to the demagogue and the ambitious office seeker, whose crave for office overshadows and puts to flight other considerations, fair or unfair. I wish to quote from another Southern gentleman, not so young as my other friends, and who's always commands attention in this house by his wit and humor, even though his speeches may not be edifying or instructive. I refer to Mr. O.T. from Virginia and quote from him in a recent speech on this floor as follows. Justice is merely relative. It can exist between equals. It can exist among homogeneous people. It can exist among lions, but between lions and lambs, never. If justice were absolute, lions must of necessity perish. Open his ponderous jaws and find the strong teeth which God has made expressly to chew lamb's flesh. When the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals shall overcome this difficulty, men may hope to settle the race question along sentimental lines, not sooner. I am wholly at sea as to just what Mr. O.T. had in view in advancing those thoughts contained in the above mentioned quote. Unless he wishes to extend the simile and apply the lion as a white man and the Negro as a lamb. In that case, we gladly accept the comparison. For of all animals known in God's creation, the lamb is the most inoffensive and has been in all ages held up as a badge of innocence. But what will my good friend of Virginia do with the Bible? For God says that he created all men of one flesh and one blood. If the gentleman to whom I have referred will pardon me, I would like to advance the statement that the musty records of 1868 filed away in the archives of Southern capitals as what the Negro was 32 years ago is not proper standard for which the Negro living on the threshold of the 20th century shall be measured. Since that time, we have reduced illiteracy of the race at least 45%. We have written and published nearly 500 books. We have nearly 800 newspapers, 3 of which are dailies. We have now in practice over 2,000 lawyers and a corresponding number of doctors. We have accumulated over $12 million worth of school property and about $40 million worth of church property. We have about 140,000 farms and homes valued in the neighborhood of $750 million and personal property valued about $170 million. We have raised about $11 million for educational purposes, and the property per capita for every colored man, woman, and child in the United States is estimated at $75. We are operating successful several banks, commercial enterprises among our people in the Southland, including 1 silk mill, 1 cotton factory. We have 32,000 teachers in the schools in this country. We have built, with the aid of our friends, over 20,000 churches and support 7 colleges, 17 academies, 50 high schools, 5 law schools, 5 medical schools, and 25 theological seminaries. We have over 600,000 acres of land in the South alone. The cotton produced mainly by black labor has increased from 4,669,770 bales in 1860 to 11,235,000 in 1899. All this was done under the most adverse circumstances. We have done this in the face of lynching, burning at the stake, with the humiliation of Jim Crow laws, the disenfranchisement of our male citizens, the slander and degradation of our women. With the factories closed against us, no Negro permitted to be a conductor of the railway cars, whether they run through the streets of our cities or across the prairies of our great country. No Negro permitted to run as an engineer on a locomotive. Most of the mines closed against us. Labor unions, carpenters, painters, brick masons, machinists, hackmen, all these supplying nearly every conceivable avocation for livelihood, have banded themselves together to better their condition, but with few exceptions, the black face has been left out. With all these odds against us, we are forging our way ahead. Slowly, perhaps, but surely. You may tie us and then taunt us for our lack of bravery. But one day we will break the bonds. You may use our labor for 2.5 centuries and then taunt us for our poverty. But let me remind you, we will not always remain poor. You may withhold even the knowledge of how to read God's word and learn the way from earth to glory and then taunt us for our ignorance. But we would remind you that there is plenty room at the top, and we are climbing. After enforced debauchery, with many kindred horrors incident to slavery, it comes with ill grace from the perpetrators of these deeds to hold up to the shortcomings of some of our race to ridicule and scorn. It was intended to give the United States, Mr. Chairman, permit me to digress for a few moments for the purpose of calling the attention of the House to a bill which I regard as important, introduced by me in the early part of the first session of this Congress. It was intended to give the United States control and entire jurisdiction over all cases of lynching and death by mob violence during the last session of the Congress. I took occasion to address myself in detail to this particular measure. But with all my efforts, the bill still sweetly sleeps in the room of the committee to which it was referred. The necessity of legislation along this line is daily being demonstrated. The arena of the lyncher no longer is confined to the southern climes, but is stretching its hydra head over all parts of the Union. Sow the seed of a tarnished name, you sow the seed of eternal shame. It is needless to ask what the harvest will be. You may dodge this question now. You may defer it to a more seasonable day. You may, as the gentleman from Maine, Littleford, puts it, waddle in and waddle out until the mind has left in doubt whether the snake that made the track was going south or coming back. This evil, peculiar to America, yes, to the United States, must be somehow, someday met. Mr. Chairman, before concluding my remarks, I want to submit a brief recipe for the solution to the so-called American Negro problem. He asked no special favors, but simply demands that he be given the same chance for existence, for earning a livelihood, for raising himself in the scales of manhood and womanhood that are accorded to kindred nationalities. Treat him as a man. Go into his home and learn of his social condition, learn of his cares, his troubles, and his hopes for the future. Gain his confidence, open the doors of industry to him, and let the word Negro, colored, black be stricken from all the organizations enumerated in the Federation of Labor. Help him to overcome his weaknesses. Punish the crime-committing class by the courts of the land. Measure the standard of the race by its best material. Cease to mold prejudicial and unjust public sentiment against him. And my word for it, he will learn to support, hold up the hands of, and join in with the political party that institution, whether secular or religious, in every community where he lives, which is destined to do the greatest good for the greatest number. Obliterate race hatred, party prejudice, and help us to achieve nobler ends, greater results, and become satisfactory citizens to our brother in white. This, Mr. Chairman, is perhaps the Negro's temporary farewell to the American Congress. But let me say, Phoenix-like, he will rise up someday and come again. These parting words are on behalf of an outraged, heartbroken, bruised and bleeding, God-fearing, faithful, industrious, loyal people, rising people, full of potential force. Mr. Chairman, in the trial of Lord Bacon, when the court disturbed the counsel for the defendant, Sir Walter Raleigh raised himself to the full height and addressed the court saying, "Sir, I am pleading for the life of a human being. The only apology that I have to make for the earnestness with which I have spoken is that I am pleading for the life, liberty, and future happiness and manhood suffrage of 1/8 of an entire population of the United States. I yield my time.
He asks no special favors, but simply demands that he be given the same chance for existence, for earning a livelihood, for raising himself in the scales of manhood and womanhood that are accorded to kindred nationalities. The same chance for existence in a democracy is not possible without the right to vote. By 1901, as we've heard, North Carolina had all but extinguished that right for the Black man. But it didn't happen without a fight, and George White was in it till the end. Beginning in 1898, the year the white supremacist Democrats defeated the Progressive Fusionist coalition of Republicans and Populists that Tim talked about so well, White used his power as the leading Black elected official in the state to try to subvert the endgame, the passage of a constitutional amendment that would disenfranchise Black men. That he failed was perhaps inevitable. That he tried was a story we need to know. His chief antagonist was a man we've heard of already, Josephus Daniels, News and Observer editor and Democratic Party firebrand. Daniels did not play fair, for it's never a fair fight when your enemy buys ink by the gallon. And yes, Tim, 40 years later, we know that in his memoir, he was apologetic, but it was, of course, a lot too little too late. There was a pivotal moment before the 1898 election that summer at the Republican convention. Previous conventions in 1894 and 96 were boisterous affairs, giddy with the prospect of victory through fusion with the populace. And they were victorious. The Fusionists gained the majority in the General Assembly in 1894 and sustained it in 1896. But by summer 1898, backlash had set in. The Republican Convention of 98 took place under the gathering cloud of the Democratic Party's white supremacist campaign, a relentless drive that would culminate in November with stuffed ballot box victories at the polls and deadly violence in Wilmington. At the convention, the Negro was held in check and was more quiet than in the past, the Raleigh Morning Post wrote of the daytime session. But then night came on. Congressman White, now running for a second term, thundered before the convention with a bold pronouncement. The Democrats are going to say that I am a Negro office holder, he was reported to have said. Yes, and there are going to be more just like me. The Constitution gives me the right to vote, and this gives me the right to hold office. I am going to be in the fight and work for the principles you have adopted. Now, note what he's saying. I'm going to work for your principles. The Morning Post stops there with his pledge of party solidarity. The N&O, though, saw his bravado and raised it to belligerence. Here we read, I am not the only Negro who holds office. There are plenty more being made to order to hold offices. And then, I invite the issue. If you come into my district, I will have a joint debate. The News and Observer was suggesting that the issue for which Congressman White was willing to fight was Black political power. Which was closer to the truth? Neither paper could be accused of fondness toward White. The Morning Post called the speech vile and rampant. Weeks after the fact, they published his rebuttal. He said he'd been misquoted and that I do not favor raising the race problem. But the Morning Post didn't have the reach of the News and Observer, and even they later reprinted Daniels' version, as did many other papers in the state. Unwilling to let it go himself, a month after the convention, editor Daniels gave the passage special treatment on page 1, complete with an engraving of the congressman with fists clenched and text that read, "In the course of his speech, White moved to the front of the rostrum and shaking his clenched fist in the direction of the delegates said, 'I am not the only Negro who holds office. There are others. There are plenty more being made to order to hold offices. The Democrats talk about the color line and the Negro holding office. I invite the issue.'" And now the paper says he was cheered to the echo. I think that's an allusion to Macbeth. I applaud you to the very echo. And by the way, if you didn't have a chance to pick up my handout, you can see it. You can see the engraving. I've got some of the graphics that Daniels used. Looking back years later, 2 leaders of the 1898 revolution claimed that whites inviting the issue became the very grounds upon which the white supremacist battle would be waged. Really? Here we have a claim that white behavior had single-handedly or fistedly caused Wilmington to burn. Now, that's a powerful politician, or maybe a scapegoat. But the wildest moment in Daniels' smear campaign came on the 1st of November, 1898, 6 days before the election. On the front page of the N&O, straddling the fold, in boldface and outlined in black like a death notice, was a sensational headline painting White's wife as a gun runner. "Negro women active. Congressman White's wife gets rifles, and his daughter asks Negro women not to work for white people." The congressman's wife was a music professor. She taught at Plymouth Academy, where James is from. His daughter was an 18-year-old school teacher. It was fake news, and yet the final sentence said it all. "The white people are ready and prepared for any emergency." Whatever would unfold in the coming days, the red shirts on horseback literally whipping up the vote, the coup in Wilmington, the argument was being laid that the Black people had asked for it, had invited it all. White was reelected that November, as we know, largely because neither the Democrats nor the populists could get their act together in the 2nd District, and Tim had more to say about that. But statewide, the result was as intended. Democrats dominated in the General Assembly of 1899 by a factor of 4-1. While they set out to draft an amendment to the North Carolina Constitution, adding the literacy test, the grandfather clause, and the poll tax, Congressman White decided to stage an intervention. He assembled prominent Black men from around the state to write a petition entreating the lawmakers to reconsider. The Council of Colored Men of the state convened on January 18th. After a heated debate, their final draft was the coolest of pleas, beseeching the General Assembly not to pass any legislation that would blunt our aspirations, ruin our manhood, and lessen our usefulness as citizens, but guarantee us an equal chance with other men to work out our destiny. And we ask you to continue your friendly aid toward us, which has so marked the good relations between the 2 races in our state in the past. The phrasing, in a way, is classic George White, previewing the words we've heard in his 1901 speech and recalling another rousing speech he had made in the House in 1898. "An even chance in the race is all we ask. And then, if we cannot reach the goal, let the devil take the hindmost." But the delivery here, as you can tell, is very different. In measured tones, the petition begins with an appeal to common citizenship of the state that gave us birth, recalling that, as slaves, we were faithful to all the trust imposed on us. It concluded by pointing to the virtues that, as freedmen, they had sought to embody. As citizens, we have endeavored year after year to improve our condition materially, educationally, and religiously, and we trust that no obstacle will be placed in our way, that we may continue to become better citizens, remembering that the welfare of the state depends for its future happiness and prosperity upon all its constituent parts. But for all the care they took to channel their righteous anger into respectful pleading, for all their appeal to shared values, they got nothing. If anything, the strategy backfired. On February 17th, in the speech making prior to the House vote, Representative George Roundtree acknowledged having met with the committee. Evidently, or at least as he heard them, they had doubled down on humility. They acknowledged that their race had made little progress during the last 30 years and assigned as a reason that they were but a few years out of savagery and fewer out of slavery, that the habits and traditions of that debased state still clung to them. In this admission, Roundtree said, they assigned the true cause. The results of the last 4 years in North Carolina have demonstrated that the Negro is unfitted for self-government, he declared, sounding the theme of the day. There weren't many Black men in the State House in 1899, but they did speak out. One of them was Isaac Smith from New Bern. You say this law don't discriminate against the Negro, he charged. Why, your Democratic paper says right along it's for that, and I'd sign it and swear it. You know it's done for that. You'd sign it and swear it. You say it's not for that? Then bless your sweet souls, what's it done for? Smith could play the Uncle Tom and was often not taken seriously. Here again, his listeners, as you did, laughed, even when his tone darkened to stress that access to the ballot is the most serious thing on earth. I ask you most kindly to consider well what you are about to do. Take away from the colored man this privilege, and he will never again consider you his friend. Then he raised what should have been the most powerful argument, the threat of lost representation in the House of Representatives. He pointed out that Congressman White was arguing for legislation to enforce Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. Section 2 mandates a reduction in the state's representation in the House and the Electoral College in numbers proportionate to the number of eligible citizens denied the right to vote. This provision was meant to exact the harshest of punishment from states that refused to extend the franchise. But Smith's Democratic colleagues paid little attention, for they knew Congress would never pass a law to enforce this provision. There was really nothing that could be said to stop the momentum toward the votes taken in the North Carolina House and Senate on February 17th and 18th, to thunderous, even echoing applause from the galleries. But that vote, of course, was not the end. The bill had passed, but ratification would require the assent of the voters. It would be on the ballot in August 1900. To no one's surprise, except perhaps George White's, he really seemed to think it would fail. The amendment passed handily. Not until then did he announce that he would not stand in 1900 for re-election. Let's return now to the farewell address. In it, he still pushes for the bill to enforce Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. In the opinion of constitutional scholar Michael Curtis, had Section 2 functioned as it was intended, to produce universal male suffrage or to punish states that refused to provide it with a substantial loss of political power, it might have changed the course of American political history. This measure did not admit of loopholes. It was just math. You might say it would have forced the issue, but it was too much to ask of a government that had already turned its back on Black men. So, this is the moment George White found himself in 1901. The Black vote was barred in defiance of the 15th Amendment. The Black voice was silenced. Black bodies could be broken indiscriminately, hung to die, strange fruit. White had learned, as Ida B. Wells had learned before him, that no matter what the attainments, character, or standing of an Afro-American, the laws of the South will not protect him against a white man. This period has been called the nadir are the lowest point in history for Black Americans. Time passed. Progress was made. All of us here today have either fought in the civil rights movement, witnessed it, or benefited from its gains. Some of us naively believed we were bending that arc toward justice. To the contrary, Nicole Hannah-Jones has said, and who am I to argue, that we are crashing toward a second nadir. And it isn't only a privileged few like Josephus Daniels who are spreading their venom with ink bought by the gallon. Anybody with a computer can do it, and they are. So let me conclude with an inconclusive conclusion that I seem to be hearing everywhere. So here we are. And now I'm going to turn to Jim and Hilary to ask, where are we?
Well, good evening, everyone. What a joy and an inspiration it is to be here with you tonight. We live in a dark moment, and more important than ever, I think, to gather on occasions like this and to be reminded of our strength and that we are not alone, all right? And what is an ongoing struggle for justice in this country. We're going to try some slides here. That's okay. Well, the first slide, I will admit, was going to look rather shameless. And it was the cover of Fragile Democracy. James, thanks for mentioning the book. The point was not there to sell books, but to invite you, and I will just do this verbally, to invite you to visit Fragile Democracy, one word, fragiledemocracy.com. And one of the things you'll find there is a visual digital exhibit that tells the story, much of what we've been hearing tonight, and what I'll try to add to it here. Oh, there we go. Once I've apologized for the shamelessness, it appears. But feel free to shoot that QR code. And I will try to bring this story from George White up to where we are in the present day. Tim, I think we had some sort of psychic bond as we prepared for tonight, because what I have written here is exactly the place you ended. And that is that in the immediate aftermath of disenfranchisement, many champions of white supremacy, flush with their victory, proclaimed that they had solved what they called the Negro problem for all time. But more astute observers understood that every new generation would have to sort out for itself those underlying questions of race and democracy. And that's because even under the oppressive weight of Jim Crow, Black North Carolinians refused to surrender their claim on equal citizenship and a fair share of economic opportunity. I tell you what, I will just wave and have you advance. Okay. The technology, this feels like every classroom on campus. It always works until it needs to work. But in the 19-teens and 20s, many Black citizens who had been denied their legitimate rights left North Carolina. And if we have the next slide, they joined the Great Migration to the industrial cities of the Northeast, where they secured jobs, gained access to the ballot, and found a political voice in the Democratic Party. Here at home, Black activists also began to abandon the party of Lincoln in order to mount a challenge to Jim Crow at its source, that is, within the Democratic Party's white supremacist Southern wing. One of the chief proponents of that strategy was Lewis Austin, here in the next slide, editor of the Carolina Times, Durham's African-American newspaper. Austin and other influential leaders created the Durham Committee on Negro Rights, Negro Affairs in 1935, and a state committee a few years later. Their goal was to register voters and to put Black candidates on the Democratic ballot. And that strategy was in turn picked up by local voter movements affiliated with the NAACP and by labor organizers, particularly those associated with the Union of Food, Tobacco, and Agricultural Workers. The next slide here. The FTA's unionization of nearly 10,000 Black tobacco workers in Winston-Salem and another 10,000 at Leaf Houses in eastern North Carolina is the subject of my colleague Bob Korstad's book, Civil Rights Unionism. And if you don't know it, I commend it to you. The next slide. After securing a collective bargaining agreement that won better pay and working conditions, the union began registering people to vote despite resistance from hostile white registrars. And as you'll see here in 1947, in the next slide, these newly organized Black workers elected the Reverend Kenneth Williams to a seat on Winston-Salem's Board of Aldermen. Now, Reverend Williams was the first African-American politician in the South to win an election against a white opponent since the end of the 19th century. Now, that success, as we move along, along with aspirations for full citizenship among Black soldiers returning from World War II, sparked the formation of local voter movements, particularly in eastern North Carolina, where much of the state's Black population was concentrated. These efforts, in the next slide, were organized by leaders like Reverend James Felton. You see there, he was a Marine veteran, and James Walker, one of the first Black graduates of UNC's law school. And the next slide, by 1953, 8 Black candidates had won election to county and municipal governments in the region in eastern North Carolina. And here you see Congressman Butterfield's father, G.K. Butterfield Sr., taking the oath of office, being sworn in as a member of Wilson's Town Commission. The next slide, white backlash against these incremental gains. Backlash was swift and decisive. In Wilson and other communities across eastern North Carolina, the legislature reached in and changed the structure of government from ward-based systems to at-large systems. And I think we all know that at-large elections make it very difficult for minority candidates to represent a politician, a representative of their choice. It's simple mathematics. If the ballot says there are 5 candidates, vote for 3, you might vote for the one Black candidate, and then you cast 2 more ballots against that candidate. The only recourse, and you can, this is the relevance here of the map, was what was called single shot or bullet voting. Vote for the candidate of your choice and no others. Won't surprise you that the legislature outlawed that practice. Community by community, again, mostly across eastern North Carolina. And at the state level, lawmakers made very similar changes by increasing the number of multi-member districts in the state legislature. Again, most of those multi-member districts concentrated in the east. And they were very public, unapologetic for their purpose. They declared that the goal here was to ensure, and I'll quote them, that no Negro could get elected to the General Assembly. And the effort worked. It was largely successful. By 1980, only 4 Black politicians served in the state legislature. Now, the effectiveness of these rearguard maneuvers notwithstanding, Jim Crow's days were numbered. And we see here Lyndon Johnson, Martin Luther King at his side, signing the Voting Rights Act in 1965, provided the legal means to mount a constitutional challenge in the federal courts. In North Carolina, the tipping point came 20 years later. In the case of Jingles versus Edmonston, I actually worked on some of the research in that case as a graduate student. The U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina ordered the elimination of most of those multi-member districts, and the results were transformative. We'll go to the next slide. By 1989, 19 Black lawmakers served in the General Assembly, and in 1991, Dan Blue was elected Speaker of the House. At that point, the highest elected office in this state held by a Black politician. Over the course of the next 2 decades, a progressive biracial alliance within the Democratic Party made major new investments in public education. If we'll go to the next slide, healthcare and early childhood education. You will remember, if you were alive and participating in politics at the time, one of the signature programs, Smart Start. Now, to secure these investments, progressive lawmakers also removed barriers to political participation. And they did this, if we'll go to the next slide, by introducing reforms that included things we're now familiar with: early voting, same-day registration, out-of-precinct provisional voting, and the pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. The consequences, if we'll go to the next slide, of this little d democratization of state politics, the consequence was most evident, of course, in 2008 when Barack Obama carried this state by a margin of just 14,000 votes. The next slide, we of course all know what came next. The Tea Party movement in 2010 gave conservative Republicans a majority in the General Assembly. On the next slide, those lawmakers redrew district lines, maps, in order to give themselves a veto-proof majority. And in 2013, they passed House Bill 589, the most sweeping, comprehensive revision of election law in this country. They would have rolled back all of those election law reforms. This is the bill, House Bill 589. You'll recall the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals described as targeting minority voters with, in the words of the court, near surgical precision. Conservative lawmakers lost the battle over House Bill 589, but they were determined to win the war. If we go to the next slide, and this, of course, is now becoming contemporary history. They poured enormous resources into stoking public anxiety over alleged widespread voter fraud, of course, in the absence of any evidence whatsoever. And this was part of a nationwide campaign, often characterized by dog whistles and outright racial appeals that vilified Black and Hispanic voters. The upshot, of course, was the ratification in 2018 of a voter photo ID amendment to North Carolina's Constitution. If we have the next slide here. So the architects of this political retrenchment also moved to restrict economic opportunity as well. And this is a fundamentally important point, for us to remember that the struggle over voting rights from George White's time to the present day has always been inextricably bound to the struggle over economic rights and economic opportunity as well. So when I say restricting economic opportunity, just to remind yourself of what lawmakers did in that period after 2012. They eliminated the earned income tax credit. Economists left, right, and center would agree that it is one of the most effective ways of battling poverty. On an inflation-adjusted basis, they reduced investments in public education, and of course, most recently, they have expanded the state's private school vouchers program. And make no mistake, the challenge to our democracy is ongoing. Both the state and U.S. Supreme Court have now ruled that there is no constitutional barrier to extreme partisan gerrymandering. And of course, remember that to the degree that party is a proxy for racial and ethnic identity, extreme partisan gerrymandering is extreme racial gerrymandering. They are one and the same. Seizing that opening, the president has rallied Republicans in Texas and Missouri, and yes, here in North Carolina, around a redistricting campaign that I think you can describe only as being based unapologetically on the principle of might makes right. And there are clear signs of what more is yet to come. The administration, you may know, has demanded access to state voter databases. That was a demand in Minnesota. And in recent weeks has signed confidential agreements with at least 10 states that would give the U.S. Department of Justice the authority to reach in and specify voters for removal. Earlier this month, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the new Save American Voter Eligibility Act. Now, that's Orwellian, right? If you think about who comes up with these titles, but what it would do is it would require photo ID in all elections and the presentation of either a birth certificate or a passport as proof of citizenship. Now, half of all Americans do not have a passport. And this affects all sorts of people. Those of you who are married women in the audience, I dare say your passport and your birth certificate probably don't align, right? So just kind of ponder the possibilities here. And of course, here in North Carolina, the State Board of Elections has granted local officials broad discretion in restricting early voting and closing polling places on college campuses. So what is to be done? Well, I'm a historian, so I get to dodge that question, except to make a reference to history. And as I sort of kind of take the measure of the moment, it seems to me we have to take a lesson from George White and his fellow fusionists, as Tim so well described them for us. A lesson about the necessity of organizing across the racial and ethnic lines that too often divide us one from another. When I think about the current moment, I'm reminded of these words from a populist fusionist, words spoken in 1892. I think you might just as well speak them today. Here's what he said, addressing an audience of Black and white voters. You are kept apart that you may be separately fleeced of your earnings. You are made to hate each other because upon that hatred is rested financial despotism, which enslaves you both. You are deceived and blinded that you may not see how this race antagonism perpetuates an economic system that beggars both. A lesson indeed, I think, for our own times.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me this evening. It's wonderful to be with such esteemed panelists and a tremendous performance, very different than just reading it. So grateful to be here tonight. I have the privilege of partnering with communities who are fighting on the front lines for voting rights in North Carolina and throughout the South. And Dr. LeLoudis gave a great summary of the challenges that we're facing in North Carolina recently. I've been tasked with discussing more in depth the legal landscape, and particularly the Supreme Court landscape. I'm going to warn you, this is going to be a rough ride. I promise we will end on a high note. But I would like to just touch on a few recent Supreme Court decisions. In short, over the past decade plus, we have seen a steady retrogression of the protections that voters have, that our courts will guarantee, and particularly the protections that have been crucial to ensuring an equal opportunity to the ballot box for Black and Brown and other minority voters. This period of retrogression echoes prior periods of retrogression by the courts. But this most recent period of retrogression was triggered in 2013 by the Supreme Court holding in Shelby County v. Holder, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But essentially, this Supreme Court decision struck down a really core provision of the Voting Rights Act. Essentially, there was a provision of the Voting Rights Act that required states with a deep history of racial discrimination in voting to pre-clear any changes to their voting mechanisms with the Department of Justice or a federal court before those could be used in an election. And this pre-clearance protection was absolutely crucial to protecting predominantly Black and Brown voters, but actually benefited all voters by ensuring robust protections for voting. The Supreme Court struck this provision down, saying that the formula for deciding who had to pre-clear their laws was outdated and that it was infringing upon states' rights. And I question you to think about other times in history when the Supreme Court has been worried about infringing upon states' rights. So the Supreme Court held that this coverage formula for who had to pre-clear their laws was too overbroad. They struck it down. Congress has failed to enact a new coverage formula. So this whole pre-clearance process has not been in effect since 2013. There is a proposal for a new clearance provision in the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. It reintroduced every single year. It has not moved, unfortunately. So what did the Supreme Court signal with this 2013 decision? I believe that it signaled to lower courts, litigants, and state legislatures that the Voting Rights Act was in the court's crosshairs. I believe this was a signal to others to bring additional challenges to provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And so after this decision, we saw a rash of voter suppression initiatives throughout the South. So that includes some of the provisions that Dr. LeLoudis talked about, which hit after 2013. And it also includes extreme racial gerrymandering in North Carolina's state legislative and congressional maps. Thankfully, those were struck down in the last decade. Now, after this 2013 decision in Shelby County, we've seen a series of additional decisions from the Supreme Court that have furthered this retrogression. As Dr. LeLoudis mentioned, in 2019, in a case also outside of North Carolina, the Supreme Court held that it will not strike down partisan gerrymanders. It actually will not even hear those claims in federal court. It held them non-justiciable. In 2021, in a decision called Branovich versus Democratic National Committee out of Arizona, the court again ruled on the Voting Rights Act, this time Section 2, and it essentially held that racial disparities caused by state action in voting were fine if they were below a specific threshold. So a de minimis what it called a de minimis impact on racial minorities was not a violation of the Voting Rights Act. Anybody in a state, especially like North Carolina, knows that our margins come razor thin, right? 2020 North Carolina Supreme Court, a racially contested election, came down to 400 plus votes. That is less than one vote for every municipality in this state. So even de minimis racial disparities can result in the loss of a candidate of choice for voters. But the court failed to protect voters in that case. And then most recently in 2024, in a decision out of South Carolina, this was a challenge to South Carolina's congressional district, new congressional plan. The court held that states have an extremely high presumption of good faith when they are drawing their voting districts. And so it created this enormous burden on plaintiffs trying to strike down voting plans as racially discriminatory. Essentially, if there's any partisan explanation for a configuration in a voting plan, then the court signaled lower courts should essentially hold that these are non-justiciable issues of partisan gerrymandering and deny the claims. So in just about what we're seeing is that the court has moved towards green lighting what it attributes state action to be as mere partisanship. But as Dr. LeLoudis touched on, of course, in many areas throughout the South, partisan divides are completely mirrored by racial divides. So this means that in areas with severe racially polarized voting that mirrors partisan divides, it becomes extremely difficult to challenge discriminatory voting laws and redistricting plans. This includes, to this day, areas of North Carolina. So in the historic Black Belt, the northeast of North Carolina, in the area where George H. White was actually elected, to this day, we have severe racially polarized voting. Voters who self-identify as Black or African American join together at rates of 95% plus to support candidates of their choice. On the other hand, voters who self-identify as white join together at rates estimated as high as 85% to oppose those candidates. But of course, those divides, 95% and 80%, also mirror partisan divides. Now, recently, when we brought a challenge, we were very privileged to represent the North Carolina NAACP, Common Cause, and several very brave individuals to challenge North Carolina's 2023 voting plans. We put this evidence before the court, and they held that that extreme racial divide in voting patterns was merely a partisan divide. This in a state that to this day has a 12% racial voting gap between white and Black voters. And they are saying this is just partisan vote dilution. It's not racial. As recently as last year in the mid-decade redistricting, we saw this same area of the state targeted once again. When the General Assembly came back in October of 2025, it targeted the same historic congressional district in the Northeast and completely dismantled it. This congressional district has been consistently electing candidates of choice for Black voters since 1992. And when we rushed to challenge that once again, the court once again found that this dismantling of this very historically significant congressional district was merely a partisan ploy and had nothing to do with the proven harm that it would cause to Black voters in that area of the state. We're seeing the same things happen in other states. In Texas, we saw 5 districts that had been opportunity districts for Black and Latino voters were dismantled When that went up to the Supreme Court held again merely a partisan intent. These are claims that you cannot bring in federal court, and indicated that those claims should be dismissed as well. So the end all be all is that these decisions together have basically provided a very clear formula for states wanting to dilute the voices of Black and brown voters. And that is, one, ensure that your elections are racially polarized. And then two, claim that anything you do that might diminish those voices of Black and brown voters is just merely a partisan ploy. And I just want to highlight that this default to providing a race neutral explanation for what ends up being very harmful practices echoes, it's nothing new. It echoes what has been done in prior times, including the literacy test, which everybody knew what the literacy test was about, but on paper, it was drafted, quote unquote race with a race neutral facade. And I believe that's exactly what's happening again today throughout the South. So the recent failure, I promised I would end on a high note. So what is the recent failure of courts to protect voters underscore? Well, first of all, as Dr. LeLoudis mentioned, it does underscore the importance of a renewed coalition of voters dedicated to voting rights, in solidarity with the communities that are fighting these fights on the front line. It also requires congressional action, including outlawing partisan gerrymandering, but also strengthening the protections of the Voting Rights Act. And I will mention that in 1982, when the Voting Rights Act was strengthened through congressional action, that actually followed several devastating Supreme Court decisions, much like the ones that I just discussed. And so these devastating Supreme Court decisions showed Congress that you really need to act, because the courts are not going to protect voters. And I'm hopeful that the decisions that I've just talked about will build Congress and leaders to prioritize these issues of protecting voters. But there's also hope that we could have more robust state protections, because we could also have a North Carolina Voting Rights Act. We would also need a state Supreme Court willing to enforce that, by the way. But there's a lot of room for hope and optimism here. Recent polling in North Carolina shows that voters of all political affiliations support anti-gerrymandering initiatives at rates about 80%, Republican, Democratic, unaffiliated. Folks do not like gerrymandering of any kind. There's also enormous support for an independent citizens commission drawing our districts. By the way, that's what most of Western Europe does. That's what a lot of other democracies do, and they think we're crazy for letting our politicians draw their own lines.
Yeah.
So there is support for that in the state. That would require a constitutional amendment here. And as you might know, we do not have a citizen referendum. We do not have a way to get that on the ballot without the General Assembly putting it on the ballot for us. But I personally have also witnessed incredible mobilization of communities across the state, including in the Northeast, to fight back against these oppressive laws and restrictions. And just recently, we're seeing student voters mobilize across the state to oppose the failure to provide them with early voting opportunities on their campuses, including, I believe, what is the largest historically Black college or university, North Carolina A&T. But we're seeing this actually mobilize students to come out to vote. And it's worth mentioning that this issue of youth voter suppression that we're seeing more and more, this is very intersexual with racial voter suppression, because of course our young voters are our most racially diverse and also our most racially progressive. So I do just want to mention that there is an intersection with that early voting closure issue there. So at base, while these tactics that we're seeing definitely have echoes of these prior times of retrogression, I also believe there's a lot of evidence that, like George H. White correctly predicted, I do believe the pendulum will swing back, but it will only do so if we continue to mobilize and if we continue to demand equality for all.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I really don't know where to begin. Look at the clock. I'm a good steward of time, and so certainly I will not keep you beyond 8 o'clock. I promise. But let me actually begin by thanking you, James Williams, for all of your work. You have labored long and hard in making this evening what it is. And I just want to thank you for your friendship and thank you for all that you do. To the friends of the library, thank you for the work that you do. I noticed on the flyer you highlighted Jim Clyburn's new book, The First Eight. Jim Clyburn is one of my very best friends. I texted him while I was sitting there a moment ago, and he thanks you for highlighting his book and wants you to know that he will be in the state March 30th and 31st with three book signings, Raleigh, Durham, and Greensboro. But thank you for all the work that you do. To the Phoenix Historical Society, these two individuals back there, they are very special to me. They didn't have to get in a car and drive to Chapel Hill tonight, but they live and breathe George Henry White. They're from Tarboro, North Carolina, down in the Black Belt. I've known each one of them for many, many, many years. They have seen fit to preserve George White's home place in Tarboro, and every year they have a ceremony in front of the home, and I've been down a few times and read portions of George White's farewell speech, and I just want to publicly thank them for what they do. And when I was first elected to Congress back in 2004, at their urging, the first post office I named in the first congressional district was the George H. White Post Office in Tarboro. So thank you, Jim and Mavis, for making the trip. And to the George H. White Bar Association, that's the bar over in Durham County. Most of the African-American attorneys in Durham belong to that organization. Thank you for the part that you play. And if I can just take a personal liberty in recognizing my friend of many years, Ted Shaw. Ted and I share the same mentor. His name was Julius Levon Chambers. Julius Chambers was the preeminent civil rights attorney, not just in North Carolina, but throughout the country. And we sat at his feet, and we learned so much from Julius Chambers. And I believe Ted is still with the university with the Center for Civil Rights. You're still there. And just thank you, sir, for all that you do. And to the program participants, James, had you given me the list of participants who would be on the program tonight, I probably would have found an excuse not to come tonight. Because this is a star-studded cast, and I just want to thank you, Tim Tyson. You and I have talked on the telephone several times. We have made arrangements to get together a few times, and for one reason or another, we had to reschedule. But thank you so much. And to Dr. Kelly, your rendition, sir, of the farewell speech. I've heard many renditions throughout the years of George White's farewell speech to Congress, and I have never, ever, ever heard one that even comes close to what you have done tonight. Thank you. And what you must understand, I served in Congress 18 years, and I kind of know how the place works. The speech that George White gave in January of 1901 was during debate on an agriculture bill. And when there's debate on a bill, the Rules Committee sets time limitations for each side to debate the bill. The majority may be given 30 minutes, the minority given 30 minutes, and those time limits are strictly enforced. But for some reason, I believe that back during those days, there were not time limits on floor speeches, just as there's not a time limit now in the Senate. Senators can take the floor and talk for 26 hours, right? And some of them have done it, but in the House, we have very strict time limits. But thank you for that rendition. It was so powerful. It was so brilliant. Sally Greene, you have served Orange County well, and you have represented Orange County well tonight. And I want to thank you for that. And to the Secretary of State, 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 Sec Thank you so much. And to Jim, I can't pronounce your last name. I'm going to call you Professor Jim. Thank you for recognizing and putting up the image of my father tonight. That's a long story. That's a very long story. When my dad was an immigrant from Bermuda, went to Shaw University, went to Meharry Medical College, became a dentist, came back to North Carolina, married my mother, and settled in Wilson. When he came to the town, the white leaders called him in and welcomed him to the community and said that the lady that he had married was biracial and that they don't talk about it openly, but she is a relative of some of them, and they want to accommodate him. They want to allow him to become a registered voter. And my dad became the 40th African-American registered voter since Reconstruction, and he would often talk about that. And then he started his own little mini voter registration drive, and he was very quickly silenced. And indeed he did stop his efforts. But then there was the Depression, there was the war, and then in 1947, the year that I was born, he founded the local branch of NAACP for the single purpose of starting a voter registration drive. And as you've heard, we had wards in Wilson, and Ward 3 was the ward that was most likely to elect an African American to the city council. It was called the Board of Aldermen at the time. So they concentrated all of their energy on registering African Americans in Ward 3. They had the literacy test. So every Saturday in my living room, they would bring African American citizens in and rehearse with them what they would likely encounter at the courthouse. We were warned about that at the outset, but they would rehearse citizens on how to confront the literacy test. And then in 1953, from Ward 3, my dad ran against a white gentleman in town. There were about 400 white registered voters in the district and about 400 African American registered voters in the district. And the vote was 382 to 382. And that was the final vote. And to resolve the tie, both names were placed in a hat. A little 4-year-old white girl was blindfolded. She reached into the hat and pulled out my father's name. That's the picture. That's the picture. That's the picture that you saw on the screen. And then 2 years later, it was time for re-election. No one thought that he would be re-elected, but the mayor was in trouble. The mayor needed some African-American votes in order to be re-elected and came to my father soliciting votes. The mayor also said to my father that the business community wanted a recreation center built in the white community, and they needed to put up a bond referendum for a vote on this thing. And they didn't have enough white votes in order to get the referendum passed, and they needed African-American votes. And my dad made a political deal with the mayor. Okay, we will get African-Americans to vote for the bond, but you've got to build an identical recreation center in the black community. And it happened. So much so that the mayor, and I hadn't planned to go into this much detail, but the mayor then appointed my dad as the chairman of the finance committee in 1955, which was a pretty big deal, but it was too much for some people to accept. And so finally in 1957, 2 years later, while my family was traveling on a vacation, city council called an emergency meeting. And they came in, and my dad heard about this emergency meeting. He jumped on Colonial Airlines at LaGuardia Airport and flew back. It was a twin-engine plane to try to stop the vote, but he didn't. And so they converted the district method of election to at large, and of course he lost. And so that's the story of my father, and that's why I got involved so much in politics and in voting rights. And so it's been a good journey. So thank you, Jim, for doing that. Hilary, the Southern Coalition, I know what you guys do. It almost brings me to tears. Thank you. Yes. I know what you do. I'm a product of the Voting Rights Act. Voting Rights Act was enacted by Congress right after the Selma to Montgomery March, 1965. President Johnson said to Dr. King that it was not time now for a Voting Rights Act, that he had just used all of his political capital for a Civil Rights Act, and he could not now go back to Southern senators and ask for a Voting Rights Act. And that's when African Americans in Selma demanded a Voting Rights Act. And finally, after Valo Luizio, who was a white mother from Detroit, was in Selma protesting with my friend John Lewis and others after she was murdered, after the Selma to Montgomery March. That's when President Johnson changed his mind. March 15th, 1965, looked into the camera and said, "We shall overcome. We will have a Voting Rights Act." Well, the Voting Rights Bill was hotly debated. It was opposed by Southern senators, as you can imagine. But finally, on August 6, 1965, on August 6, 1965, the Voting Rights Act passed. What does the Voting Rights Act really mean? It's a voluminous act, but the three things that I would lift up for you are, number one, it did away with the literacy test. A lot of people don't remember that. It did away with the literacy test. It enacted a Section 2, which gave minority communities in the beginning, African-American communities, the right to litigate any grievances any claims they have, if they feel that a voting system or a practice or procedure has an effect on their voting strength. It's called Section 2. Section 2 was not relegated to any specific state or county, nationwide. Section 2 has nationwide application. It's a permanent law, and it's the law of the land. It may not be next month this time, but it is the law of the land. The other part of the Voting Rights Act is Section 5. Section 5 singled out certain southern states, 40 counties in North Carolina that had a history of discriminating in voting, and said to those jurisdictions, before you can pass any law, before you can do anything, including redistricting, you must get the approval of the Department of Justice. It was called pre-clearance. And so because of strict enforcement of the Voting Rights Act from both Republican and Democratic administrations, we have made tremendous progress in the South and certainly in North Carolina. That's why Mel Watt and Eva Clayton were elected to Congress. It didn't just happen. It happened because of enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. And now the Voting Rights Act is under attack. Some of you may know I was the chairman of the Elections Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives. Yes, I was. In 2013, that's when the U.S. Supreme Court struck down, I'm getting real technical now, Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which gives definition to Section 5. It determines which states, which jurisdictions are covered by Section 5. And what the U.S. Supreme Court said in 2013 was that until Congress can give us some more evidence, a better record, you cannot enforce Section 5. And so my committee, under my leadership, was tasked with the responsibility of traveling the country, holding field hearings on the extension of the Voting Rights Act. And I accumulated thousands of pages of testimony, and we have an excellent record that would support the extension of Section 5. But it has not happened and probably will not happen until we get a new Congress. But now Section 2 is under attack. And any day now, we are waiting for a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court as to whether Section 2 is enforceable, and if it is, under what circumstances is it enforceable. Well, enough of that. But let me just, got 4 minutes. All right, let me just thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for your willingness to sit for 2 hours and to help commemorate the 125th anniversary of George White's farewell speech to Congress. George White lived and he labored and he served and became the best recognized political figure of his day. He was well known as the political figure of his day. George White was not a transplant. Some of our Southern politicians were transplants. They had come from other states, but George White was from North Carolina, from southeastern North Carolina. He was educated in Washington, D.C., but he returned to his beloved North Carolina to become an educator and a political leader. I emphasize that. He became an educator and a political leader. We've heard so much about White's political work, but we must understand that he was also an educator. The General Assembly, during Reconstruction, had directed that a graded school be placed in each county in North Carolina, a graded school for African-American children and a graded school for white children. And the law only required one of each for each county. For example, in my county of Wilson, one graded school for African-American children was placed in Wilson. The white graded school was in Wilson, but out in the county, out in the country, as we used to call it, there were no schools established whatsoever. And so Black churches, Masonic lodges created little one-room schools. You know, when I go to country churches now to speak and to visit with these churches, you know, I just say, you know, did you all have a one-room school? Yes, sir. It was right out there. It was right out there. And so George White's first challenge in life, aside from wanting to go into politics and into law, was to be an educator. And he labored as an educator in Craven County in the graded schools, and eventually in a parochial school, and then a high school, a normal school, a teaching school was placed in the county, and he was the principal there. And so let's always remember that George White was an educator as well as a politician. The year was 1860. Abraham Lincoln is running for president. Southern states are terrified of Lincoln. They have this great fear that if Lincoln is elected president, that the first thing that he's going to do is to end slavery, to take away their property. And so after Lincoln was elected in 1860, 11 Southern states seceded from the Union, including North Carolina. And the next thing we knew, that the nation was at war, a brutal war, a civil war. Lives were being lost on both sides of the line. By 1863, Abraham Lincoln was weary. He wanted to. Okay. Good to see all of you tonight. Thank you. I can wrap it up. I can wrap it up. I'm good. He said I'm good. Okay. Okay. In 1863, Lincoln said, I'm tired of the war. I am going to do what I can to free the slaves. And on January 1st, 1863, you know about it, the Emancipation Proclamation. What the proclamation did, a lot of people miss this point, it freed the slaves in the 11 states that were in rebellion to the Union. Why just 11 states? Because Lincoln believed that he didn't have the authority to end slavery in states that were not in rebellion to the Union, because he was using his power, his executive power, as the commander-in-chief. And so he ended slavery, tried to end slavery in the 11 southern states. Well, the war continued. Lincoln is reelected in 1864. A lot of the legal scholars of the day were questioning Lincoln's authority to emancipate the slaves. They said, you don't have the power. Congress didn't act. What happens when we get a new president? Executive orders in at the end of the presidency. You know, it was a mess. And so Lincoln said, what I'm going to do is to propose a 13th Amendment added to the Constitution. And so the Civil War ends, and on January 31st of 1865, Lincoln convinces Congress to pass the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Well, we all are civic scholars. We know that that doesn't change the Constitution. It has to be ratified. And so the 13th Amendment started ratification. It went to Illinois first, and then it started going from state capital to state capital for ratification. Well, in the middle of April 14th, 1865, Lincoln was assassinated, didn't get the opportunity to see the full ratification of the 13th Amendment. Johnson becomes president. But so finally, on December 4th of 1865, North Carolina became the 26th state to ratify the 13th Amendment. It needed 27. And the next 2 days later, Georgia became the 27th state to ratify. The minute the Georgia legislature ratified the 13th Amendment, didn't require any other signatures. The very instant that Georgia ratified the amendment, 4 million enslaved people obtained their freedom. It was a significant moment in American history. 331,000 of those were right here in North Carolina, and almost 100,000 of those lived in Eastern North Carolina. And so what the legislature had to do then was to draw congressional districts. And so the decision was made by the politicians. We're going to put all of these African American, these formerly enslaved, into one single district. And they carved a district of 10 counties And they referred to it, and we continue to refer to it as the Black Second. And so immediately John Hyman from Warren County is elected. James Edward O'Hara from Enfield is elected. And then another fellow came along named Henry Plummer Cheatham. Cheatham was married to a young lady whose last name was Cherry from Tarboro, North Carolina. And Henry Plummer Cheatham served two terms in Congress. But after his last term, he had fallen in disfavor, even among African-American voters. And so 2 years later, he ran. George White was his brother-in-law. George White was also married to a Miss Cherry. The two men were married to sisters. And that's when George White went to Henry Plummer Cheatham and tried desperately to persuade him from running in the 1894 election. Cheatham wouldn't listen. Cheatham was defeated. 1896 came along and Cheatham wanted to run again. And it was a vicious contest between two brothers-in-law against each other. They went to, and what you need to know is that during those days, party nominees were chosen by conventions and not by popular vote. And the convention, I forgot how many 24 delegates. 24 delegates from the 10 counties would decide who would be the nominee. And you needed 13 in order to win. And so in 1896, Henry Plummer Cheatham could not win. And then 2 years later, 1898, Cheatham wanted to come back again, and his brother-in-law launched a public campaign against his brother-in-law, discouraging him from running. And finally, as we all know, George White was elected in 1896. He was elected in 1896 and then reelected in 1898. And then all of the brutality that we've heard about for the last hour and a half took place in 1898, the Wilmington race riot and all of the other violence that took place. And so I just want to thank you for your willingness to come out tonight and to be a part of this conversation. It's a rich history. There's so much more that I could add to it, but I would be duplicating what some of the other speakers have said, and that would not be a good idea. Thank you so very much for coming.
So thank you, Congressman Butterfield, and let's give another round of applause to our wonderful presenter. Normally, we would do some Q&A, but given the hour, I think we'll do that some other time at some other event. Okay? But thank you, everybody, for attending. Really been great. Yeah.
And Louis.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.